An elderly couple's peaceful night shattered when a fake HOA officer forced his way into their home and hurt 82-year-old Mary Lambert. Jason Miller, a career scammer who preyed on the elderly, thought it would be another easy target. But he didn't count on Walter Lambert, a World War II veteran whose courage and quick action would turn the tables. And wait until you hear how justice struck back harder than anyone expected. The night air was thick with summer warmth, settling over the quiet suburb like a heavy blanket. It was the kind of night where even the breeze seemed to have fallen asleep, and the faint hum of distant air conditioners was the only sound breaking the silence. Inside a modest, lovingly maintained home on Willow Drive, Mary Lambert slept lightly, her breathing shallow and rhythmic. Mary had always been a light sleeper, even more so in recent years. At 82 years old, every creak and groan of the old house felt amplified in the darkness. But it wasn't the house that woke her this time. It was the sudden, blinding flash of the motion sensor light on the porch. Mary's eyes snapped open. Her heart gave a quick, startled jump against her ribs. For a moment, she simply lay there, blinking at the sliver of brightness that cut across the hallway from under her bedroom door. Her mind scrambled to catch up. A raccoon? A stray dog? Maybe the neighbor's cat? Pushing aside the comforting weight of her quilt, she swung her legs over the side of the bed. The cool floor met her bare feet, grounding her in the moment. She moved slowly, her joints stiff, her nightgown brushing quietly against her calves, and made her way toward the window by the front door. She hesitated before touching the curtain. Something about the light felt different tonight, sharper, more deliberate. Gathering her courage, Mary gently pulled the curtain back a few inches and peered outside. There was a man on her porch. Her breath caught in her throat. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed in a dark, official-looking uniform. The porch light threw long shadows across his figure, making it difficult to pick out any clear details. No badge, no visible patches, only the sharp outline of a man who clearly did not belong there at this hour. Before Mary could even process what she was seeing, he stepped forward and began pounding on the door with the side of his fist. Hard, angry knocks that rattled the glass panes and echoed through the quiet house. "HOA inspection! Open up immediately!" he barked, his voice sharp and impatient. Mary's heart thudded in her chest. HOA at 2 a.m.? She had lived in this neighborhood for over 40 years and had never heard of an inspection happening in the middle of the night. It didn't make sense. A deep instinct, something old and primal, told her not to open the door. And yet, another voice, the one shaped by a lifetime of trust and respect for authority, pushed back. What if he really was from the HOA? What if it was something urgent? Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for the lock. For one fragile second, she hovered there, suspended between fear and duty. The logical part of her screamed to stop, to call someone, to stay behind the safety of the door. But politeness, that unshakable Southern politeness instilled in her from birth, won. With a small click, she turned the deadbolt. The door swung inward, barely an inch, and the man lunged forward with brutal force. The impact knocked the breath from her lungs. She stumbled backward, arms flailing as the world tilted sideways. Her foot caught the edge of a braided rug she had laid down decades ago, and she fell hard against the wooden arm of her favorite living room chair. Pain flared at the back of her head, bright and sharp. The room spun in slow motion. The man, the stranger, was already inside, his heavy boots thudding against the floor as he moved past her without a second glance. Mary tried to cry out, but the wind had been knocked from her. All she could do was lie there, stunned and hurting, as her carefully kept home was invaded by a man she didn't know, under a title she had trusted for too long. Outside, the peaceful neighborhood slept on, unaware that something very wrong was unfolding behind the Lamberts' front door. The man who forced his way into Mary Lambert's home was no official. He had no authority, no credentials, and no right to demand entry. His name was Jason Miller, a man with a long hidden history, not of service, but of deception. Jason had spent years perfecting a very specific kind of scam, one that required no weapons, no elaborate planning. Just a clipboard, a dark outfit, and the confidence to look like he belonged. His target was always the same: the elderly. Those who had spent a lifetime trusting the symbols of order, uniforms, official language, firm demands. To them, Jason presented himself as a representative of their local homeowners association, claiming emergency inspections, sudden fines, fabricated violations. He preyed on confusion, fear of authority, and the natural instinct not to cause trouble. A raised voice here, a flash of a fake document there, a heavy knock on the door in the middle of the night. It was all part of the illusion. To Jason, these homes were just easy marks, low risk, high reward. A few minutes of intimidation, a pocket full of cash or valuables, and he would vanish into the night before anyone could piece together the truth. He had done it before, in neighboring communities, on sleepy cul-de-sacs, at cozy retirement villages where vigilance had given way to trust. And tonight, he thought, would be no different. As he crossed the threshold of Mary Lambert's home, he didn't hesitate. To him, this was just another routine, another inspection. No one would question until morning, when it would be too late. He didn't notice the family photographs on the walls, the Bible tucked neatly on the side table, the crocheted Afghan draped lovingly over the back of the couch. He didn't care. To Jason, it wasn't a home, it was an opportunity. But what Jason Miller didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that this particular house, on this particular night, wasn't empty of strength. It was not just Mary Lambert who lived here. There was someone else. Someone who had seen true danger, who had faced real threats on battlefields oceans away, and who would not stand quietly while harm entered his home. Walter Lambert, 85 years old, awoke the instant he heard the crash. For a split second, still caught between sleep and wakefulness, he didn't fully grasp what had shattered the stillness of the night. But then came the sound that cut deeper than any noise he had heard in his long life, his wife's cry of fear. There was no confusion after that, only action. Walter had lived through darker nights than this one. He had stood under enemy skies half a world away, listening for sounds that spelled danger. Those instincts, honed through years of service and survival, roared back to life with breathtaking clarity. In one smooth, unhurried motion, Walter reached toward the nightstand beside his bed. His hand, though lined with age, moved with certainty. The cool metal of the old Colt 1911 greeted his touch, a familiar weight, a trusted companion from years gone by. He had kept it meticulously cleaned, oiled, and ready, even after all these decades. Some habits, Walter believed, were meant to endure, not out of fear, but out of quiet responsibility. His mind snapped into focus, sharper than it had been in years. No tremble in his fingers, no hesitation in his breath. In 3 measured heartbeats, he was on his feet. In 3 seconds, he crossed the room, moved through the doorway, and stepped into the hallway, the weapon raised, and steady in both hands. The old wood floors creaked softly under his bare feet, but Walter paid no attention. His world had narrowed to one singular mission: protect Mary. Every memory of the life they had built together, every morning coffee, every family Christmas, every quiet evening on the porch, it all pulsed behind his eyes as he advanced toward the threat without a second thought. He did not think of his age. He did not think of danger. He only knew that someone had hurt Mary, and that no one, no matter how bold or cruel, would be allowed to hurt her again. Durand. Jason Miller rifled through the drawer like a man on borrowed time. Paperclips scattered, pens rolled onto the floor. His rough hands tore through neatly folded letters and receipts, searching for anything valuable: cash, checkbooks, keys. The soft ticking of a grandfather clock down the hall marked every second that slipped away. He was so focused on his task, so sure of his dominance, that he didn't hear the approach behind him, but he heard the voice. "Get away from my wife." The sound of it froze the air in the room. It wasn't a shout born of fear or panic. It was a command, sharp, thunderous, unyielding. Jason spun around instinctively, his body tensing in alarm. His eyes darted toward the hallway, expecting perhaps a confused old man fumbling for a phone or yelling empty threats. What he saw instead stole the breath from his lungs. Walter Lambert stood there like a figure carved from stone. His frame, though weathered by time, was steady. His arms, lean and firm beneath the loose sleeves of his pajamas, held the Colt 1911 as if it were simply an extension of himself. There was no shake in his hands, no hesitation in his eyes. The years seemed to melt away from Walter in that moment. He wasn't an elderly man. He was a soldier again, clear-headed, disciplined, forged in the fires of a war that had demanded the best and the bravest. Jason, sensing the shift instantly, opened his mouth, maybe to explain, maybe to lie, but the words never found their way out. Walter's decision was already made. The first shot cracked through the air, swift and sharp. It caught Jason in the shoulder, spinning him slightly, knocking the stolen envelope from his grasp. A heartbeat later, the second shot struck his thigh. Jason stumbled backward, his body crumpling as one leg gave out under him. The third round found his hand just as he reached instinctively for the edge of the coffee table, trying to steady himself. His fingers jerked open, releasing the house keys he had taken, which clattered onto the hardwood floor with a cold, hollow sound. A fourth shot, carefully placed, struck the wall behind Jason, mere inches from his head. It was not a miss. It was a message. I could have ended this differently. Walter's expression didn't change. His breathing remained steady, his posture unflinching. The final two shots rang out with the same measured precision. By the time the echoes faded into the heavy silence of the living room, Jason Miller was no longer a threat. He lay slumped near the corner of the couch, breathing hard, stunned into stillness, overwhelmed by the speed and decisiveness of the response he had never anticipated. For several long seconds, neither man moved. Walter kept the firearm trained on Jason, standing tall, his mind crystal clear. His finger rested outside the trigger guard now, in perfect discipline, ready, but not reckless. In those seconds, something old and sacred passed between them, the unspoken understanding that the battle was over. Walter's gaze didn't waver. He didn't yell. He didn't need to. The authority of his presence alone filled the room. And Jason, for the first time that night, realized that he had never been in control. Not truly. His arrogance, his schemes, his belief that he could intimidate and overpower, all of it crumbled under the weight of a man who had already faced far greater dangers than anything Jason could ever imagine. In the faint distance, sirens began to wail, a growing chorus that drew closer with every second. The flashing of red and blue lights would soon spill across the neat, white picket fences outside, but in this house, justice had already been served. Walter remained where he was, calm and resolute, watching over his home, guarding the woman he loved. As he had done once before, in a different kind of war, half a lifetime ago, and as he would continue to do for as long as he was able. The first call to 911 was made less than 30 seconds after the final gunshot. Across the quiet neighborhood, lights flicked on in windows, curtains twitched, phones were picked up with trembling hands, neighbors' voices urgent as they spoke over one another, trying to explain what they had heard. Gunfire, sharp, rapid, coming from the Lambert house. In the distance, sirens awoke the night. The sound began faintly, a low hum against the backdrop of chirping crickets, but it grew louder with each passing second, swelling into a wailing chorus of urgency. Blue and red lights began to stain the edges of the streets, dancing across brick facades and tall oak trees. Inside the Lambert home, time seemed to slow. Walter Lambert remained exactly where he had planted himself, a silent sentinel standing between harm and his wife. The Colt 1911, still gripped firmly but safely, pointed toward the floor now. His finger rested carefully along the side of the frame, following every rule he had been taught decades earlier. At his feet, Jason Miller lay groaning softly, shifting weakly but making no attempt to rise. The fight, if it could even be called that, was long since over. Walter's eyes moved constantly, from Jason to Mary's still figure across the room, to the door he knew would soon burst open. He listened to every small sound, the clicking of the grandfather clock, the labored breaths of the intruder, the growing pitch of the sirens outside. His mind stayed clear. He knew what would happen next. He had prepared for it the moment he had squeezed the first trigger. It wasn't fear that gripped him now, it was the weight of responsibility, the solemn understanding that defending a home didn't end with the last shot fired. It would end only when the truth was known. The screech of tires against asphalt outside snapped the final strings of silence. Seconds later, heavy boots pounded up the front steps. Commands rang out, sharp, practiced, unmistakable. "Police! Show your hands! Drop your weapon!" Walter immediately complied, lowering the Colt carefully onto the side table. He raised both hands high, palms out, stepping slowly back from Jason without a word. The officers, 4 of them in full tactical gear, swept into the house with trained precision. Their flashlights cut across the living room, illuminating the broken scene. The elderly woman lying unconscious but breathing, the wounded man sprawled on the floor, the old veteran standing upright, calm and compliant. In moments, the officers surrounded Jason, securing him without resistance. One officer approached Walter, his weapon lowered once he assessed the situation. "Sir, are you injured?" he asked, voice clipped but respectful. Walter shook his head once. "My wife," he said simply, his voice steady but roughened with emotion. "She needs help." Paramedics rushed in behind the officers, their movements quick and efficient. They carefully lifted Mary onto a stretcher, checking her vitals as they prepared to transport her. Meanwhile, a sergeant began walking Walter through what had happened. Walter recounted the events without embellishment. The man pounding on the door, forcing his way in, attacking Mary, searching through their belongings. His account was short, direct, and matched exactly what the officers could see for themselves. There were no signs of forced entry by Walter, no aggressive pursuit beyond defense, no recklessness, only a clear, immediate response to an unlawful invasion. Under Texas's Castle Doctrine, the law that allows homeowners to defend themselves against intruders. Walter's actions were not just understandable, they were protected. The sergeant gave a firm nod, his expression softening slightly. "You did what you had to do, sir," he said quietly. "We'll take it from here." Walter closed his eyes for just a second, allowing himself the first small breath of relief since the nightmare had begun. But he stayed on his feet, stayed present, until Mary was safely in the ambulance and Jason was cuffed and carried out of the house. Only then, standing alone in the middle of his ransacked living room, did Walter allow himself to lower his head and whisper a silent promise. "Never again, as long as I draw breath." The flashing lights of the ambulance cut through the dark streets as it sped toward the nearest hospital. Inside, Mary Lambert lay quietly, her face pale but peaceful under the watchful eyes of the paramedics. Walter followed close behind in a police escort vehicle, his hands clenched tightly, his mind replaying every second of what had happened. At the hospital, doctors moved quickly. Tests were run, evaluations made, and finally, after what felt like hours compressed into minutes, the results came back. A mild concussion, several deep bruises, but no fractures, no internal injuries. "She's lucky," the attending physician said, "and you acted fast. That made all the difference." Walter nodded silently, his chest tightening with a mix of relief and lingering tension. He sat beside Mary's bed, gently holding her hand as she rested. Meanwhile, Jason Miller was taken into custody at the local precinct, the charges against him piled up swiftly. Felony burglary, assault on a senior citizen, impersonating a public official, attempted grand larceny. There was no ambiguity this time, no chance to slip away unnoticed. Authorities soon uncovered a pattern in Jason's actions, linking him to a string of similar crimes in nearby neighborhoods. Thanks to Walter's quick response, a predator who had relied on fear and confusion to operate now faced the full weight of justice. As morning light crept through the hospital windows, Walter remained at Mary's side, her heartbeat steady under his fingertips. They had survived the night, and together they would see this fight through to its rightful end. The story spread faster than anyone could have predicted. By sunrise, news outlets across Austin had picked it up. By noon, it had reached every corner of the state. Grandpa shoots, fake HOA cop to save wife. WWII veteran defends home, exposes criminal. The headlines screamed across television screens and news websites, painting Walter Lambert as a living legend, a symbol of courage in a world that often seemed to have forgotten what true bravery looked like. Reporters lined the sidewalks of Willow Drive, careful not to cross onto the Lamberts' neatly trimmed lawn. Neighbors, once strangers in passing, now stopped at the edge of the driveway to wave, shout words of support, or simply leave small notes of thanks tucked beneath the mailbox. At the local grocery store, people recognized him immediately. They approached cautiously at first, men tipping their hats, women reaching out to squeeze his hand, children staring wide-eyed at the man their parents now spoke of with admiration. "Thank you, sir. You're a real hero. Wish we had more folks like you around." Walter, never one for the spotlight, handled it the only way he knew how, with quiet humility. He would tip the brim of his well-worn cap, offer a small, respectful nod, and say simply, "Just did what I had to do." There were no speeches, no grandstanding, just the solid, steady dignity of a man who believed in duty, not for fame, not for reward, but because it was the right thing to do. But beneath that modest exterior, beneath the soft-spoken words and humble smiles, burned a quiet pride. It wasn't pride for having used force. It wasn't pride for the attention. It was pride for having stood up when it mattered most. For protecting Mary, the love of his life, for defending the home they had built together, piece by piece, over decades. Walter never sought the role of a hero, but sometimes real heroes don't seek the title. Sometimes they earn it, simply by refusing to stand down when it matters most. And in the hearts of those around him, neighbors, friends, strangers who had only heard his story, Walter Lambert would forever be remembered not just as a man who fought back, but as a man who reminded them all what courage truly looked like. The courthouse was filled with a hushed tension the day Jason Miller finally stood trial. Reporters lined the hallways. Local residents filled every available bench in the small courtroom, their faces a mix of curiosity, anger, and hope. Walter and Mary Lambert sat quietly near the front, hand in hand. Walter wore his only dark suit, the same one he had worn to family weddings and graduations, polished shoes shining softly under the courtroom lights. Mary, still recovering, leaned gently against him, her strength returning day by day. When the prosecutor rose to speak, the room seemed to lean forward in unison. The case was laid out with precision and clarity. The prosecutor didn't resort to dramatics. He didn't need to. Security footage from the Lamberts' porch camera showed Jason pounding on the door, forcing his way inside. Inside the house, investigators had found fingerprints matching Jason's on drawers and cabinets. More damning still, multiple other victims had come forward once Jason's face was aired on the news. Elderly couples, widows, veterans, all had similar stories. A man impersonating an HOA official, using fear and confusion as weapons. Jason's pattern of behavior was unmistakable. It wasn't a moment of desperation. It was a deliberate, repeated choice to prey on the vulnerable. The defense tried to argue for leniency, tried to paint Jason as desperate, as misunderstood, but the jury saw the truth. They returned the verdict swiftly, without hesitation. Guilty on all counts: burglary, assault on a senior citizen, impersonating a public official, attempted grand larceny. When the judge spoke the sentence aloud, 22 years without the possibility of parole. There was no noise, no outcry, only a quiet ripple of relief through the room, like a heavy weight finally being lifted. No plea bargains, no second chances. Justice had been served, fully, fairly, and without compromise. Walter sat very still as the verdict was read, his hand still wrapped tightly around Mary's. He didn't smile. He didn't celebrate. He simply lowered his head for a brief moment, closed his eyes, and let the finality of it settle deep into his chest. Mary squeezed his hand gently, and for the first time in many long, difficult weeks, Walter allowed himself to truly breathe again. The fight was over, and this time the good guys had won. In the days and weeks that followed, life in the quiet neighborhood of Willow Drive slowly found its rhythm again. The patrol cars stopped cruising by as often. Neighbors once wary of shadows on their porches began to leave their porch lights on again, not out of fear, but as a quiet gesture of community and watchfulness. Inside their home, Mary Lambert grew stronger each day. Her bruises faded from deep purple to soft yellow, and the sparkle slowly returned to her eyes. The only lasting mark of that terrible night was a small, pale scar just above her right brow, a faint reminder of how close darkness had come to their doorstep. But Mary wore it not as a wound, but as a badge of resilience. Walter remained much the same, steady, present, quietly vigilant. He still polished the old Colt 1911 once a week, carefully, methodically, the way he had done for decades, not out of fear, not out of anger, simply because he understood, better than most, that peace was a precious thing, worth protecting. But deep down he hoped he would never have reason to raise it again. Time, as it always does, carried them forward. When spring arrived, the neighbors organized the first community barbecue of the year, a simple affair of folding chairs, paper plates, and the easy laughter of families gathered under a soft blue sky. Walter and Mary arrived a little late, walking slowly, hand in hand. Conversations hushed for a moment as people turned to greet them, smiles breaking across faces young and old. Someone, no one remembered exactly who, raised a cup high into the warm afternoon air. "To Walter and Mary," they called out. The crowd picked up the toast instantly, their voices loud and proud. "To Walter and Mary," proof that courage doesn't have an expiration date. Walter, embarrassed but touched, simply tipped his hat and pulled Mary a little closer to his side. Mary laughed, a sound clear and bright as a bell, and for the first time in a long while, the two of them truly let themselves relax. The food tasted sweeter that day. The laughter rang louder, and the worries that had weighed down so many hearts seemed, at least for a little while, to lift away on the spring breeze. In that moment, under the wide Texas sky, surrounded by friends and neighbors, it felt as if the world had found its balance again. A little older, perhaps, a little wiser, but also, in a way that mattered most, a little safer.